Model secret affair with Dubai Tycoon leads to shocking murder mystery. Hook. Behind the glamour of a model's life lies a dangerous game of power, betrayal, and murder. What happens when a mysterious businessman pulls her into a deadly web of secrets? Stay tuned, because the shocking truth is about to unfold. You won't believe what happens next. The air in the penthouse was thick with tension. A dim light flickered above the large glass windows, casting faint shadows. Lara stood by the window, her eyes scanning the vast city below. The shimmering skyline of Dubai seemed peaceful from where she stood, but her mind was far from calm. Her affair with Khaled had always been a secret, an exciting, dangerous game. At least, that's how it had started. But lately, something felt off. Khaled had grown distant, his messages colder. He'd promised to meet tonight, but he was late. Lara couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The silence in the penthouse was deafening. Every footstep in the hallway made her jump. Her phone buzzed. A message from Khaled. Asterisk, don't wait for me. Go home. Asterisk. The words didn't sit right. She had never felt so uneasy. The door creaked open behind her. A cold breeze swept through the room. Lara turned quickly, her heart racing. But no one was there. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up. She stepped back toward the door. A shadow moved in the corner of her vision. Was it a trick of the light? Her pulse quickened as the shadow became clearer. A man stood in the doorway. His face was hidden in the dark. He stepped forward, slowly. Lara couldn't breathe. The man was tall, imposing. The air felt heavier with every step. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, glimmering object, a knife. Lara froze, her throat tight. Her mind raced, trying to think of an escape. But the door was behind her, and the man was blocking the only way out. The man's voice was low, almost a whisper. You shouldn't have trusted him. Lara's eyes widened. Khaled? She tried to speak, but the words caught in her throat. The man took another step forward. His eyes gleamed with cold malice. And then he lunged, the silence stretched between them, suffocating. Lara's heart pounded in her chest, every beat louder than the last. Khaled's eyes never left hers. His breath was heavy, but there was no sign of relief. Lara took a step back, unease crawling up her spine. Something wasn't right. Khaled, what's going on? She asked again, her voice shaky. But he didn't respond. His hands were still trembling, clutching the knife with a white-knuckled grip. The bloodied man on the floor lay motionless, but there was no sense of triumph in Khaled's expression. Instead, his eyes were filled with something else. Something dark. I told you to leave, Khaled muttered, barely audible. Lara flinched, her stomach churning. Leave. What did he mean by that? Her thoughts spiraled. But before she could say anything, Khaled turned, walking toward the balcony. Lara's pulse quickened. What are you doing? She asked, panic rising in her chest. Khaled didn't answer. The air was thick with tension as he stepped outside, leaving her alone with the body. Her mind raced, and every inch of her screamed at her to run. But where could she go? Lara moved toward the door, but then a sound made her freeze. A soft shuffle, a groan. The man on the floor wasn't as dead as he seemed. Her breath caught in her throat. The injured man's eyes fluttered open, bloodshot and wild. He looked directly at her. His lips parted, but all that came out was a strangled rasp. Lara took a step back. Her pulse surged. She had no idea what to do. The man tried to push himself up, but collapsed back to the ground. His face twisted in pain, and then in anger. You don't know what you've gotten into, he gasped. His words were barely coherent, but Lara understood the gravity of what he was saying. She didn't have time to process. Without thinking, she bolted for the door, her legs shaking beneath her. She had to get out. Khaled had lied. Everything was a lie. And the truth was far worse than anything she had imagined. As she reached the hallway, she heard Khaled's voice. It was distant, cold. "Don't try to leave, Lara." Her breath caught. He was already on to her. And she knew in that moment she wasn't going to make it out of this alive, that Lara's legs felt like they were made of lead, each step heavier than the last. Her mind raced. Khaled's voice echoed in her ears, a warning, a command. But she couldn't stop. Not now. She didn't know where she was running to, only that she had to get away. The hallway stretched before her, eerily silent. The penthouse was too quiet, too still. Her breath was shallow, her heart pounding in her ears. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps from behind made her freeze. Khaled's voice again, this time closer, more menacing. "I said, don't run." She turned her head just in time to see him emerging from the shadows, his face unreadable. Lara's body tensed, instinct telling her to fight or flee. But her body betrayed her. She was trapped. "Lara," he said, his tone eerily calm. "Why are you doing this?" she gasped. Khaled's eyes flickered with something dark, something that made her stomach turn. "I warned you." He took a step forward. "Warn me." Her voice wavered. "You should have listened." The words sent a shiver through her, a cold, creeping fear spreading through her chest. Lara glanced frantically around, searching for an escape, but there was none. She was cornered. Khaled moved closer, his steps slow, deliberate. A bead of sweat rolled down her forehead. "Why?" she whispered, her voice cracking. Khaled smiled, a cold, twisted smile. "You were never supposed to know," he said, his voice now dripping with disdain. Lara felt the weight of those words sink in like a stone in her gut. Everything was a lie. Her affair with him had been a trap. The man on the floor wasn't just an attacker. He had been a warning. And now Lara was the one caught in the web. The fear clawed at her, gnawing at her insides. What did he want from her? "Don't look so scared," Khaled said, his eyes glinting with something dangerous. "I won't kill you yet." Lara's pulse raced, her breathing erratic. His words made no sense. What was he planning? But before she could react, Khaled reached into his coat and pulled out a small, sleek device. A phone. He tapped the screen, his eyes never leaving hers. Lara's stomach dropped. What was he doing? And then he smiled again. "Your life is about to change forever," he said softly. Lara's mind raced, panic surging through her. She didn't understand, couldn't understand. But in that moment, she knew one thing for certain. The game was no longer hers to play. Khaled's finger hovered over the screen of the phone, the device glowing in the dim light. Lara's breath caught in her throat as he tapped the screen with a calm, deliberate motion. What had he done? The seconds seemed to stretch on forever as she watched him, every instinct in her telling her to run, to fight. But her body was frozen, a prisoner to the horror unfolding before her. "You'll regret this," Lara said, her voice barely a whisper. Khaled didn't flinch. Instead, he held the phone up, displaying the screen to her. On it, a video played grainy footage of a dark alley. A woman. Lara's heart skipped a beat. It was her own face, just a few months ago, walking alone in the night. The video zoomed in, revealing her every move, the camera hidden somewhere in the shadows. Khaled's smile grew wider as he saw her reaction. "I've been watching you," he said quietly, as if it were nothing. You filmed me?" Lara choked out, the words tasting like bile in her mouth. Khaled nodded, his eyes cold, unfeeling. "Not just you," he murmured. Lara felt the blood drain from her face. Her mind reeled. The video was just the beginning. She remembered that night, how she'd felt safe, unaware of the eyes that had been following her every move. She had thought she was alone, but Khaled had been watching, and now it was too late. She took a step back, shaking her head. No, this isn't happening. But Khaled wasn't finished. He tapped another button on the phone. This time, the screen flashed with a new message. Lara's eyes widened as she saw the words appear. Asterisk, you've been compromised. Asterisk. What do you mean? She asked, her voice trembling with fear. Khaled didn't answer at first. He simply stared at her with that same unsettling smile. And then, slowly he spoke. I've made sure your life is in my hands now. Lara's stomach twisted into knots. The phone buzzed again, this time showing an image. A photo of her mother, her father, her friends. Each face was circled in red, like a target. They're all in danger, Khaled said quietly. Lara's breath caught in her throat as the full weight of his words crashed down on her. She felt the walls closing in, the panic rising. No, she whispered, backing away. Don't, he warned, his tone chilling. Don't try to escape. There's no point anymore. Lara's mind was spinning. She thought of her family, her friends. Could they be in danger too? But Khaled's voice cut through her thoughts like a knife. You have no choice now, Lara, he said, taking a step closer. I own you. And in that moment, as the room seemed to darken around her, she realized she was caught. A pawn in a game, she never understood. Lara's chest tightened, the weight of Khaled's words sinking in like lead. She was trapped. Every escape route she'd considered vanished in that instant. The walls seemed to close in around her, suffocating her with each passing second. Khaled stepped closer, his cold eyes never leaving hers. Her throat felt tight, her voice a mere whisper. I won't let you control me. But even as the words left her lips, she knew they were empty. Khaled didn't flinch. You already are, he said softly, his tone almost pitying. She backed away, her fingers brushing the cool glass of the window. The city outside seemed so distant now, as if it no longer belonged to her. Khaled's grip on power was too strong. Everything had been calculated, planned. She had been a pawn in a game she never understood. You don't get it, Lara spat, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and anger. I'm not afraid of you. Khaled's smile faltered, just for a split second. Then it was back, colder than before. Don't fool yourself, he replied, his voice low. You should be. Lara's heart pounded against her ribcage, but something inside her sparked. A flicker of defiance. She wasn't going to let him win. She couldn't. But as she turned toward the door, a cold realization hit her. The man from earlier, the one Khaled had knocked out, was still inside. Was he playing her too? Was this just part of some bigger trap? Her mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. Khaled's phone buzzed again, the screen flashing with another message. It was from an unknown number. Asterisk, you know what you need to do. Asterisk. Lara's pulse quickened. It was clear now. This was no longer about her. This was about control, manipulation, and danger that ran deeper than she could fathom. She turned back to Khaled. Who are you? She asked, her voice a little stronger now. Khaled's eyes flickered, something almost imperceptible shifting behind them. I'm the one who decides what happens next, he replied quietly. A shiver ran down Lara's spine. I'll make you regret this, she said through gritted teeth, the words filled with quiet desperation. But Khaled didn't seem threatened. In fact, he almost looked entertained. Do you honestly believe that? His voice was low and amused. You have no idea how deep this goes, Lara. No idea at all. Lara's head swam, the pieces of the puzzle scattered and incomplete. The truth was out of her reach, and with each passing moment, she could feel it slipping further away. She had been drawn into something far darker than she had imagined. And now, there was no turning back. That Lara's legs felt like jelly beneath her, but she forced herself to stand tall. Khaled's words echoed in her mind, haunting her, but she couldn't afford to let fear take over. She had to think, had to act. But as the minutes stretched on, she realized something worse than fear was creeping in. Helplessness. Khaled was right. She didn't understand the full scope of what was happening. And every moment she wasted here, she felt herself being pulled deeper into his web. His eyes flickered, scanning her as though calculating her next move. "You're not the first to try to run," he said, as if reading her mind. The cruel smile returned. "And you won't be the last." Lara clenched her fists. She refused to be just another name in a long list of victims. "Why?" she demanded, her voice rising in a desperate plea. "Why me? What do you want from me?" For a moment, Khaled's expression changed. Something like regret flickered across his face, but it vanished as quickly as it appeared. "I didn't want this," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Lara froze, her breath catching. "What do you mean?" she asked cautiously, stepping closer. Khaled's eyes met hers. This time, there was no coldness, no malice, just exhaustion. "I never meant for it to go this far," he said, his voice cracking. But before Lara could process what he had just revealed, the door to the penthouse crashed open. Both of them whipped around. A figure stood in the doorway, tall, imposing. It was the man from earlier. He was alive. His clothes were stained with blood, but his face was eerily calm. Khaled took a step back, his eyes widening in recognition. "Jamil," he murmured under his breath. Jamil's gaze never wavered from Lara. "You shouldn't have gotten involved," he said, his voice cold and final. Lara's heart skipped a beat. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to come together, but they made no sense. You're behind this too?" she asked, her voice shaking. Jamil didn't answer. He moved toward her slowly, his eyes never leaving hers. "I warned you, Lara," Khaled said, his voice low and filled with regret. But it was too late. Jamil grabbed her wrist, his grip like iron, and yanked her towards the door. Lara tried to pull away, but his strength was overwhelming. "You've seen too much," he said, almost apologetically. "Now you have to make a choice." Lara's mind raced. A choice? Her pulse pounded in her ears. She had no choice. There was no escape. Khaled stood in the background, silent, his face unreadable. And for the first time since this nightmare began, Lara felt a surge of pure, unadulterated fear. Jamil's grip tightened around her wrist, sending a jolt of pain through her arm. Lara tried to pull away, her breath coming in sharp gasps. But Jamil's hold was unrelenting, his eyes now cold and calculating. She glanced back at Khaled, but he didn't move. His silence felt like an answer, a betrayal. "What do you want from me?" Lara's voice cracked, desperation creeping into her words. Jamil didn't answer immediately. Instead, he pulled her further into the hallway, away from the penthouse. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if the weight of the situation was sinking in with every inch they moved. Lara's mind raced. She had to get away. She had to find a way out. Her eyes darted around, but the hallway was empty. There were no guards, no hidden doors, nothing. Just the oppressive silence that seemed to grow thicker with every step they took. Jamil stopped in front of the elevator, pressing the button to call it down. Lara felt the tension in the air, as if the walls themselves were closing in on her. The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime. Jamil gave her a shove, and she stepped inside, her heart pounding. The doors closed with a sharp hiss, and they began their descent. Lara felt her stomach twist. Every second felt like an eternity. The descent felt endless, as if she were falling into the very depths of this nightmare. She stole a glance at Jamil, who stood rigid beside her, his face unreadable. "I don't know what you think I know," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I don't even know who you are." Jamil's gaze finally flickered toward her. His expression was hard to read, but there was something darker behind his eyes, something cold and dangerous. "You'll know soon enough," he replied cryptically. The elevator came to a sudden stop, jolting her out of her thoughts. The door slid open, revealing a dark underground garage. The air was thick with the scent of oil and metal. Lara's breath hitched as she stepped out, her eyes scanning the area for any signs of escape. But there were no windows, no exits. Only rows of parked cars, the muffled hum of the city far above. Jamil pulled her forward, toward a sleek black car parked at the far end. "You're going to help us," he said coldly, as if it were a simple fact. Lara's heart raced, her mind screaming in panic. "No, I won't," she shot back, trying to wrestle her arm free. But Jamil was stronger, his grip like iron. "You don't have a choice," he said, his voice low and menacing. His words chilled her to the bone. He shoved her into the back seat of the car. The door slammed shut behind her, and the engine roared to life. Lara was thrown back against the seat as the car sped off into the night, the dark city skyline blurring past her. There was no escape, no way out, and she knew, deep down, that this was just the beginning of something far worse. The car hurtled through the darkened streets, its tires screeching against the asphalt. Lara's heart raced, her mind spinning in confusion and fear. Jamil sat across from her, his expression unreadable, his eyes fixed straight ahead. She glanced out the window, but all she could see were the flashing streetlights, the darkness swallowing the city around her. Where was he taking her? The silence in the car was suffocating. Lara's thoughts were a chaotic blur. But one thing was clear. She had to escape. She had no idea where Jamil was taking her, but she couldn't afford to wait and find out. Her pulse quickened as she considered her options. The doors were locked. The windows were sealed. There was no way out. But she wasn't going to give up that easily. Lara shifted in her seat, subtly testing the door handle, praying it was just a little loose. Nothing. She glanced back at Jamil. His face was cold, distant. It was as if he knew exactly what she was thinking. His gaze flickered briefly to her, and then back to the road. "I wouldn't try it," he said, his voice as calm as ever. Lara's breath caught in her throat. "Try what?" she asked, her voice shaking. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a sleek black device. A phone. Lara's heart skipped a beat. Another message. He tapped a few buttons, and the phone came to life with a soft glow. Without a word, he handed it to her. Lara stared at the screen, her stomach tightening with dread. A photo of her family, her mother, her father, each face circled in red. Her heart thudded painfully in her chest. "They're safe for now," Jamil said coldly, his voice low. "But if you don't cooperate, I can't promise that'll last." Lara's breath caught in her throat. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of his words, but it felt like her thoughts were slipping through her fingers. The man in front of her moved toward the car, pulling open the door. His eyes didn't meet hers, but Lara could feel the weight of his presence. It was suffocating. "We're wasting time," the man growled, his impatience clear. Jamil turned toward the man, his gaze unwavering. "No, we're not," he replied. His tone was final. The man stepped back, giving Lara one last, icy look before turning to head toward the warehouse. Jamil, still holding her wrist, nudged her toward the exit. "Get out," he said quietly. Lara's heart pounded in her chest. She knew this wasn't a simple meeting and negotiation. This was the moment where everything changed. She was being pulled into something far deeper than she could have ever imagined. And there was no turning back. That Lara's breath caught in her throat as Jamil tugged her roughly from the car. The cold night air hit her like a slap, sending a shiver through her bones. Her heart raced, but she didn't resist. She couldn't afford to make him angry now. Her body felt heavy, her legs unsteady beneath her, but she forced herself to move forward. The warehouse loomed ahead, its silhouette dark and imposing against the moonless sky. Jamil walked behind her, his grip like a vice around her arm, guiding her to the large metal doors that creaked open at his command. As they stepped inside, the smell hit her first, the musty, decaying scent of old wood and rust. The place was cavernous, the air thick with dust and the echoes of their footsteps. Lara's eyes strained to adjust to the dim light, but she could barely make out the shapes of men gathered in the far corner. They were watching her, their faces masked with indifference, but their eyes were cold, calculating. Lara felt a wave of nausea hit her, but she fought it back, standing taller despite the fear gnawing at her insides. "Sit down," Jamil ordered, pushing her toward a chair in the center of the room. Lara's stomach churned. This was real. This wasn't just some twisted game. These men, they were dangerous. And now, she was in the heart of their operation. She sank into the chair, her body rigid, her mind racing for any way out. Jamil stood beside her, his presence like a shadow hanging over her. The man who had greeted them earlier, tall, muscular, stepped forward now, his steps heavy and deliberate. "You're here because we have something you want, Lara," he said, his voice low and menacing. Lara's eyes darted between him and Jamil. She could feel the weight of their gaze, like a pressure on her chest. "I'm not interested in anything you have to offer," she shot back, trying to keep her voice steady. The man's smile was slow, almost mocking. "That's where you're wrong," he said, leaning in close. "Because we have everything you care about." Lara's stomach dropped. The mention of her family made her heart freeze. Her mind raced, trying to piece together the significance of his words. What did they want with her family? And more importantly, what did they expect her to do? Jamil's grip on her arm tightened, as if sensing her rising panic. "Listen closely, Lara," Jamil said, his voice cold, calculated. "We need your help, and you're going to give it to us. If you don't—" He didn't finish his sentence. He didn't need to. Lara's heart slammed in her chest. "They have my family." She felt a chill wash over her. There was no escaping them. Not now. But that didn't mean she was ready to surrender. Not yet. The man with the cold smile leaned back, crossing his arms over his chest. "We'll give you time to think it over," he said, his tone almost too casual. "But understand this. You make the wrong choice, and your family will suffer for it." The words hung in the air like a thick fog, suffocating her. Her throat tightened, her mind spinning. Was this really her only option? To cooperate with monsters who held her loved ones hostage? The fear was overwhelming, but beneath it, there was something else, something burning inside her. "I won't give in." For a moment, she thought she saw something in Jamil's eyes, something almost like doubt. But it was gone too quickly for her to be sure. The man stepped back, nodding toward the shadows. "Let's give her a few minutes to think." Jamil hesitated, his gaze lingering on her. Then, without a word, he turned and followed the man into the darkness. Lara was left alone. The silence was deafening, but in that silence, she made a decision. She couldn't let them control her. She couldn't let them win. Whatever it took, she had to fight. Lara sat there, her hands clenched tightly in her lap, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The silence in the warehouse felt suffocating, each second dragging on like a weight pressing down on her chest. She couldn't let them break her. Her mind raced, searching for any possible way to fight back. Her family, her heart twisted at the thought of them in danger. They had nothing to do with this, but they were being held hostage, caught in a web she couldn't see. Think, Lara. Think, asterisk. Her eyes darted around the dark space. There had to be something, anything she could use. The chair she was sitting in creaked under her weight, the only sound in the otherwise still room. Her gaze shifted to the far corner, where a stack of crates, was piled up haphazardly. She took in a sharp breath. There was a long metal rod sticking out from one of the crates, just barely visible in the dim light. It was small, but it could be enough. Her eyes narrowed. It was a chance, a slim one, but it was the only one she had. Lara shifted in her seat, subtly testing the ropes that bound her wrists to the chair. They were tight, but not impossible to break free from. She tugged at them gently, slowly, without drawing attention to herself. Minutes felt like hours, but finally, she managed to loosen one of the knots just enough to slip her hand free. Her heart pounded in her chest, adrenaline surging through her veins. The metallic taste of fear lingered in her mouth, but she pushed it aside. She reached for the rod, her fingers trembling as she grasped it. It was cold to the touch, but there was a satisfying weight to it. Now, all she had to do was make her move. Her ears strained to catch any sound, footsteps, voices. But the warehouse remained silent, save for the distant hum of machinery she could barely hear. Lara stood slowly, her legs shaky but determined. She crept toward the door that led further into the depths of the warehouse, her eyes scanning for any signs of movement. She didn't know how long she had, but she had no intention of waiting for them to come back and make her choices for her. She was going to take control. Her breath caught as a sound echoed from the far side of the room. Footsteps. She froze. Lara ducked into the shadows, her body pressing against the cold, rough wall as she held her breath. The footsteps grew louder. She could hear them now, 2 men. They were coming closer. Her heart hammered in her chest, but she kept her body still, every muscle tense, waiting for the right moment. The footsteps stopped, just a few feet away. Lara didn't wait. She lunged, her makeshift weapon raised high. The first man let out a sharp yell as the rod slammed into his side, knocking him off balance. She didn't give him a chance to recover. With a swift movement, she swung the rod again, this time striking him across the head. The man crumpled to the ground, unconscious. Lara's breath came in short gasps, her hands shaking, but she didn't hesitate. She turned toward the second man, who was still reeling from the unexpected attack. Before he could react, Lara swung the rod again, catching him in the chest. He stumbled backward, but Lara didn't stop. She followed him, her movements fueled by a mixture of fear and adrenaline. With one final blow, the man collapsed, his body hitting the floor with a heavy thud. Lara stood there for a moment, panting, her pulse racing, her heart still pounding. She had done it. For the first time since she'd been dragged into this nightmare, she felt a flicker of hope. But it wasn't over yet. She needed to move. Now, she dashed toward the exit, her mind focused only on getting out, getting to her family before it was too late. The door swung open with a creak, and she stepped into the cool night air, her eyes scanning the dark horizon for any sign of an escape. But as she took her first step toward freedom, something caught her eye. A figure, a shadow in the distance. And then, before she could react, a sharp pain exploded in her side. The sharp pain in her side hit like a bolt of lightning, burning through her body. Lara gasped, stumbling forward as she clutched her side, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She spun around, her eyes wide, searching for the source of the attack. There, standing in the doorway, was Jamil. His eyes were cold, distant, his gun still aimed at her, the barrel steady in his hand. The world seemed to slow around her as her pulse thundered in her ears. She staggered, trying to stay on her feet, but the pain in her side was overwhelming. She could feel the blood soaking through her shirt, warm and thick, staining her skin. Jamil's voice was low, almost calm as he spoke. "Did you really think you could escape?" Lara's vision blurred, but she refused to fall. Her knees shook, but she stood tall, glaring at him through the haze of pain. "You won't win," she spat, her voice shaky but defiant. Jamil took a step closer, his expression unreadable. "I don't need to win," he replied, his voice almost a whisper. "I just need you to understand that you're not in control anymore." Lara's mind raced, trying to focus, trying to think through the agony flooding her senses. She had no weapon left, no strength, but she couldn't give up, not when she was so close. "Why?" she forced out, her voice strained, her body trembling. Jamil's eyes flickered for a moment, and for the briefest second, something like regret flashed across his face. But it was gone in an instant. "This isn't personal, Lara," he said quietly, his gaze never leaving her. "This is about survival." Her blood was pumping out faster now, each breath more difficult to draw, but Lara refused to let him see her fear. She wanted to fight. She wanted to find a way out. But as she swayed on her feet, she realized something she hadn't wanted to admit. She was running out of time. Jamil's face softened, just for a moment. Then, in one swift motion, he lowered the gun, letting it hang loosely by his side. Lara's breath hitched. Was this it? Was he letting her go? But no, there was no way. She knew better. Before she could react, Jamil reached forward and grabbed her wrist, pulling her toward him with a surprising force. "I told you," he said, his voice cold. "You don't have a choice." She could barely hold herself up, the world tilting dangerously around her. But something inside her sparked, a final surge of defiance. With all the strength she could muster, Lara drove her knee into Jamil's abdomen. He grunted, momentarily loosening his grip as he staggered back. She didn't waste the opportunity. With a burst of adrenaline, she pushed him away, spinning toward the door. Her vision was fading, her legs weak beneath her. But she had to keep moving. She staggered toward the exit, each step harder than the last. But she kept going. The door. It was just ahead. But as she reached for the handle, the unmistakable sound of footsteps echoed behind her. Heavy, determined. Lara turned, her heart sinking, only to see Jamil advancing once more, his expression hard as stone. And then, just as she was about to make a final dash, a voice rang out from the shadows. "Let her go." Lara froze, her breath caught in her throat. The voice was familiar, but she couldn't quite place it. A figure stepped forward from the darkness, tall, with a commanding presence. The man's eyes locked onto Jamil's, and in that instant, everything shifted. The figure stepped into the dim light, revealing himself fully. It was Khaled. Lara's heart skipped a beat. For a moment, she couldn't process what she was seeing. Khaled, the man who had promised to protect her, the man she thought she could trust, stood there now, his face cold, his eyes hard. "Let her go," Khaled repeated, his voice low but firm. Jamil looked at him, his expression unreadable. "Do you really think you have the power to change this?" he asked, his tone mocking. Khaled didn't flinch. "I'm not here for power, Jamil," he replied, taking a step forward. His hand was on his gun now, a subtle but unmistakable movement. Lara felt the tension in the air shift, like the entire room was holding its breath, waiting for something to break. Jamil's gaze flickered toward Khaled, then back to Lara. For a moment, it seemed as if the world itself had paused. Lara's mind was spinning. Was this the same Khaled she had known? The same man who had acted as her protector? Or was there something else going on? Something deeper, darker than she'd ever realized? Jamil, after a long silence, finally broke the standoff. "You think you can stop me?" he asked, his voice growing colder. Khaled didn't hesitate. With a single fluid motion, he drew his gun and aimed it directly at Jamil. "You've made a lot of mistakes, Jamil," Khaled said quietly, his voice like ice. Taking Lara was the biggest one. Lara's mind raced. She couldn't make sense of it. Was Khaled working with Jamil? Was this a trap? Or was he truly on her side? For a moment, it felt like time itself had stopped. The only sounds were the faint hum of the lights overhead and the rapid, uneven beat of Lara's heart. Jamil stood motionless, his eyes locked on Khaled, his jaw clenched tight. And then, in a blur of motion, Jamil made his move. Before Lara could react, he lunged, drawing a weapon of his own from inside his jacket. The sharp crack of a gunshot rang through the warehouse. Lara froze, her eyes wide, her breath caught in her throat. She had no idea who had fired first. Khaled stumbled back, his expression contorting with pain. Lara's eyes widened as she watched him stagger, a dark stain spreading rapidly across his chest. "No," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Khaled fell to his knees, his eyes locked onto her in a moment of silent desperation. His hand reached toward her, his fingers trembling, but his strength was gone. Khaled collapsed to the ground, his gun slipping from his hand, his breath coming in shallow gasps. Lara's world shattered. Tears blurred her vision as she rushed to his side, her heart pounding in her chest. "Khaled, no, please," she cried, her voice shaking as she knelt beside him, her hands desperate to stop the blood pouring from his wound. But it was too late. His eyes were closing, his body limp in her arms. Why didn't you tell me?" Lara whispered, her voice cracking as she shook him gently. Khaled's lips parted, his eyes flickering for a brief moment. I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice barely a breath. And then, with a final, rattling exhale, he was gone. Lara's sobs echoed in the empty warehouse, her body trembling as she clutched his lifeless form. Jamil stood a few feet away, his gun still pointed at her, his expression unreadable. "You should have known, Lara," he said coldly. "He was never going to save you." Lara's hands shook as she let go of Khaled, her tears staining her face. But in that moment, something shifted inside her. The anger that had been simmering beneath the surface, the determination that had kept her fighting for so long, ignited like wildfire. Her grief turned to rage, and with that rage came clarity. She wasn't done. Not yet. Lara turned to face Jamil, her eyes burning with fury. "You're wrong," she said, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. "I'm the one who's going to end this." She reached for the gun Khaled had dropped. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Lara felt in control again. Lara stumbled toward the exit, her body aching, her mind a whirlwind of confusion. She needed answers desperately, but her instinct screamed that now was not the time to ask. The cold night air hit her as soon as she stepped outside, the sharpness of it grounding her, snapping her back to reality. Her chest rose and fell in shallow breaths as she looked around, trying to orient herself. But the world felt disorienting. She had just watched a man die, Jamil. And now this stranger, someone who had been in the shadows all along, saving her, and then vanishing like a ghost. The questions swirled in her mind, each one louder than the last. Who was he? What did he want from her? She glanced down at the ground, seeing Khaled's blood staining the earth beneath her feet. Her stomach churned, but she pushed the nausea aside. Her grief, her confusion, could wait. Her priority was survival. She needed to get to her family. Her hands shook as she wiped away the tears, blurring her vision. There was no time for weakness. Lara's legs felt like jelly, but she forced herself forward, walking in the direction of the road. She had no idea what had just happened or why that man had intervened, but she was no fool. This wasn't over. The darkness behind her was suffocating, and she couldn't help but feel it chasing her. She didn't know if she could trust anyone anymore. The world felt wrong. Everything was wrong. The air grew colder as she walked, and the quiet hum of the city became a dull roar in the distance, the only sound filling her ears. Her mind raced with thoughts of escape, of her family, of the life she had before all of this began. But it all felt so distant, like something she couldn't reach anymore. It was as though the walls of the world were closing in around her. The sound of a car approaching interrupted her spiraling thoughts. She looked up, her heart pounding in her chest. The headlights blinded her for a moment before the car pulled up beside her, slowing to a stop. Lara's pulse quickened. Was this the end? Had they found her? The door opened, and a familiar face appeared. It was Farid. Her heart skipped a beat. "Lara," he said, his voice low, his eyes scanning her up and down, taking in her disheveled state. "What happened? We need to go. Now." Lara hesitated, her instincts telling her to be wary. But then she remembered. Farid was one of the few people she still trusted. He's safe. She nodded slowly, her voice hoarse. "Please, just take me to my family." Farid's face softened, but there was a sharp edge in his gaze. "They're not safe," he said quietly, his words heavy with meaning. Lara's heart sank. "What do you mean?" Farid's jaw tightened, his eyes flickering toward the road behind them, where the distant hum of another car was now faintly audible. "They've been following us. And Jamil wasn't working alone." Lara's stomach twisted. What was happening? "Get in," Farid said urgently, his eyes narrowing as he glanced behind them again. Without a word, Lara climbed into the car, her hands trembling as she closed the door. Farid's engine roared to life, and they sped off, the tires screeching as they raced down the empty road. Lara barely had time to register the movement before Farid spoke again. "Lara, listen to me. There's something you need to know. Something I've been keeping from you." Lara's mind buzzed, trying to make sense of everything, but her exhaustion weighed heavily on her. "What is it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Farid hesitated, his hands gripping the wheel tighter. "You're not just caught in the middle of this, Lara. You are the reason they're after you." Her breath caught in her throat. "What?" Farid's eyes met hers briefly before focusing back on the road, his face hardening. "The business you were involved in, the people you've crossed, the debts they owe. This isn't just about your family. This is bigger than you realize. And those people, the ones who have been hunting you, they're not going to stop until they have you." Lara's heart pounded in her chest. Everything she thought she understood about her life, her relationships, her future, it was all a lie. And just like that, her entire world seemed to crumble around her. Lara's mind whirled with Farid's words, each one sinking into her like a stone in water, dragging her down deeper. "Bigger than I realized? The business?" Her throat tightened, but she forced herself to breathe through the panic. "What do you mean, Farid?" Her voice was barely audible, as though saying the words would make the reality even more unbearable. Farid's eyes flickered toward her, the headlights casting harsh shadows on his face, making him look like a stranger. "This whole thing, it's not just about a few bad decisions, Lara. It's about the power you've gotten entangled in, the money, the deals, the people you've crossed to get where you are." Lara's heart hammered in her chest, the weight of his words pressing down on her. No, she couldn't be a part of that. Could she? "What people, Farid?" she demanded, her voice shaking now. "Tell me." Farid took a deep breath, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. "They aren't just businessmen. They're powerful figures. The kind of people who can make anyone disappear in a second. The kind who—" He broke off suddenly, glancing in the rearview mirror. Lara followed his gaze, her pulse racing. A car, a black sedan, following them at a steady pace. Her breath caught in her throat. "We're being followed," she whispered, her heart leaping into her throat. Farid's eyes darkened, but his voice remained calm. "I know. I saw them back at the warehouse." He pressed down harder on the gas, the car jerking forward as they sped down the road, weaving between the sparse traffic that dotted the night streets. But the black sedan kept up, staying just behind them, as if it were tailing them with purpose. Lara's stomach twisted, nausea rising as she felt the eyes of whoever was in that car on her back. This was no longer about survival. It was about keeping ahead of something she couldn't outrun. Farid's hands gripped the wheel tighter, his knuckles turning white, but he didn't let up. "Get down," he muttered under his breath. Lara didn't question it. She ducked instinctively, curling into the seat as the car swerved sharply around a corner, narrowly avoiding a collision with another vehicle. The sound of the tires screeching echoed in her ears, but she didn't dare to look up. She didn't want to see the car behind them getting closer, feel that sense of inevitability. Seconds felt like hours, the tension mounting with every passing moment. But no matter how fast Farid drove, no matter how many turns they took, the black sedan was still there, its headlights glaring in the side mirror, a dark predator on their tail. Her chest tightened, her breath quickening. What did they want from her? She was just a model. She was just a person in the wrong place at the wrong time, wasn't she? Wasn't she? "Farid," she whispered, barely able to get the words out. His jaw tightened, but he didn't look at her. "We have to get to a safe house," he said, his voice tight. A safe house? Lara's mind raced, but she didn't have time to ask more questions. She could barely process anything with the adrenaline coursing through her veins. Farid's foot slammed on the brake as they reached a narrow alley, the car skidding to a stop. "We can't stop here," Lara said, panic creeping into her voice. "We don't have a choice," Farid replied, his face grim. "This is the only place they won't expect us." Lara's heart was in her throat as Farid killed the engine, plunging them into darkness. The sound of the black sedan's engine was still there, but it was further behind now. But not far enough. "Get out." "Quick," Farid urged, throwing open his door. Lara hesitated for a moment, her mind spinning, but she followed him, the cold air biting at her skin as she slipped into the alley. Farid was already a few steps ahead, moving quickly. She kept pace, but her body felt heavy, as if every step was pulling her deeper into something she didn't understand. The alley was silent, except for their footsteps, the city lights casting long shadows on the walls. They came to a narrow door tucked in the corner, hidden behind a thick layer of ivy. Farid knocked 3 times, sharp, quick, deliberate. A moment passed. Then the door opened, revealing a man who looked just as grim as Farid. Inside. "Now," he ordered. Lara didn't argue. She stepped into the dimly lit room, her eyes adjusting to the darkness. Farid followed, closing the door behind them with a soft click. The room was sparse, furniture covered in sheets, the faint smell of dust lingering in the air. A small table in the corner held a few papers, but nothing that looked like it belonged to someone who lived here. Lara's breath caught as she turned to Farid. "What is this place?" she demanded, her voice hoarse from the tension in her chest. Farid's expression didn't soften, even as he pulled the door shut behind them. "This is the last safe place we have, but they're closing in, Lara. We're running out of time." Lara's pulse spiked. "Who are they?" Lara's mind was racing, her heart thundering in her chest as she struggled to make sense of everything. "Farid," she said, her voice sharp. "Who are they? Who are we running from?" Farid's eyes flickered, his jaw tightening as he crossed the room to a small desk in the corner. He didn't answer right away, his fingers tapping nervously on the surface of the desk. Lara's frustration boiled over. She stepped forward, grabbing his arm. "Tell me, Farid," she demanded, her voice breaking. "I can't do this anymore. I don't understand what's happening. I don't know who I can trust." Farid's eyes softened for a moment, but then he sighed, pulling his arm free and turning toward her. "I didn't want to involve you in this, Lara. I should have kept you out of it, but I couldn't." He hesitated, looking at her with guilt in his eyes. "What do you mean, couldn't?" "Involved me in what?" she asked, her voice low, barely able to process the words. He ran a hand through his hair, clearly frustrated. "You were never just some model. They've been watching you for years, Lara." Her breath caught in her throat. No, that's not possible. "I'm just a model," she said, her voice cracking with disbelief. Farid gave her a bitter look. "It was never about the runway or the photo shoots, Lara. It's what you're connected to, what you were born into." Lara's head spun, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "Born into?" She shook her head, unable to comprehend. "No, this doesn't make sense. I was just doing my job." Farid sighed, his face grim. "Your father, he wasn't just a businessman. He was in deep with people who had a lot more power than we ever realized. You were the leverage. You didn't know it, but they've been using you the whole time." Lara's stomach churned. Her father? Leverage? "I don't understand," she whispered. "What did they want with me? Why me?" Farid's gaze hardened. They wanted control. The money, the power, everything. They knew you were a part of his life, that you'd inherit what he built. They've been waiting for the right moment to pull you into their plans. Lara took a step back, the walls of the room feeling as if they were closing in on her. Her entire world, the one she had known, the one she had built, was now in pieces. She had been a pawn, all along, and it was too late to escape it. "I'm not the one they want, Farid. You said I'm just leverage," she said quietly, her voice trembling. "So, what now? Do I just wait until they come for me?" Farid's eyes softened, but there was no comfort in them, only determination. "We don't have a choice, Lara. We fight. We go after them before they go after you again." Before she could respond, the distant sound of tires screeching echoed through the alley outside. Lara's heart leaped into her throat. Farid's eyes darted to the small window at the back of the room, his face draining of color. "Get down!" he hissed, his voice urgent. Lara didn't hesitate. She dropped to the floor, her pulse hammering in her ears as Farid did the same, moving swiftly to the desk, where he began rifling through a drawer. The sound of the car doors slamming outside made Lara's skin crawl. Her breath hitched as the footsteps grew louder. Farid was pulling something from the drawer, a phone, a few papers, and then he motioned for Lara to stay low. The door creaked slightly, and Lara's heart skipped. "Stay quiet," Farid whispered, his voice a low growl. She nodded, but every muscle in her body was tense, ready to spring into action. The footsteps grew closer. The door handle rattled. Then, with a soft click, the door opened. The room was bathed in an eerie silence as two figures stepped inside. Lara's breath caught. It was them, the men who had been hunting her. Her pulse quickened as she strained to make out their faces in the low light. One of them was the man who had helped Farid earlier, the one who had saved her life. The other was someone she didn't recognize, tall, imposing, with cold, calculating eyes that immediately fixed on the spot where Lara had been moments before. Farid was already rising to his feet, his hand on the gun he'd pulled from the drawer. "Farid," the man with the cold eyes said, his voice deep and steady, "it's over. You know that." Farid didn't flinch, but Lara could see the tension in his posture. "We're not done," Farid said quietly. "You're not getting her. Not after everything you've done." Lara's heart hammered in her chest, the weight of the situation settling heavily on her. She was trapped, but the fire that had burned in her earlier was still there, raw, desperate. She wasn't done either. Just as she thought she couldn't take it anymore, there was a loud knock at the door. A new figure, a new player. The sudden knock echoed through the room like a death knell, sharp and unexpected. For a moment, everything froze. Farid's eyes narrowed, his grip tightening on the gun. The man with the cold eyes raised an eyebrow, glancing at the door. "Who's that?" he asked, his voice betraying a flicker of uncertainty. The tension was unbearable. Lara held her breath, Every muscle in her body coiled, waiting. Another knock, louder this time. Farid didn't move, but his eyes darted to the window, his face hardening. "Stay low," he muttered to Lara. She crouched further, her heart pounding in her chest, every instinct screaming that this was the moment everything would change. The door creaked open slowly, and the figure in the doorway stepped inside. Lara's breath caught in her throat as she saw who it was. It was the man from earlier, the one who had saved her life. But this time, there was something different in his eyes. He wasn't there to help. Lara's pulse spiked as he looked directly at her, his gaze piercing and calculating. The tension in the room escalated in an instant. The cold-eyed man took a step forward, his tone measured but dangerous. "What are you doing here?" he demanded, his voice low and threatening. The newcomer didn't respond immediately. He just stood there, calm, his eyes shifting between Farid and the man in front of him. "I think you both need to listen carefully," the newcomer said finally, his voice smooth but laced with an undercurrent of authority. Farid's eyes flashed, his hand tightening on the grip of his gun, but he didn't speak. The room was so still it felt suffocating. The newcomer stepped further inside, his gaze flicking once more to Lara. "I'm not here to play games," he said, his voice now sharp. "And neither are you. But if you want answers, and if you want to survive this, then you need to understand something." Farid's eyes never left him. "And what's that?" Farid asked, his tone tight with suspicion. The newcomer smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. "I'm the one who's been controlling the game from the start," he said, his voice chilling. "And whether you want to believe it or not, I hold all the cards now." Lara's breath caught in her throat as the meaning of his words sank in. She felt her pulse race. What did he mean? Who was he? The man with the cold eyes was silent now, his expression unreadable. "Let me guess," Farid said, his voice dripping with disbelief. "You're the one behind all of this, aren't you?" The newcomer didn't flinch. "I'm the one who makes the rules," he said simply. "And I'm the one who decides who gets to play. Including you, Lara." Lara felt the blood drain from her face. "Me. Why me?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. The newcomer's gaze never left hers. "Because your father made a deal with the wrong people," he said, his tone soft but heavy with meaning. "And you, Lara, are the last piece of the puzzle, the key to everything." Her stomach churned, the pieces of the puzzle finally falling into place. Her father wasn't just a businessman. He was someone who had tangled with the wrong people, and now his daughter was paying the price. Farid stepped forward, his gun aimed directly at the newcomer. "You're lying," he spat, his voice laced with fury. "This is all about power, money, and control. But I won't let you use her." The newcomer didn't flinch. "I don't need your permission, Farid," he said coldly. "I'm already in control." He turned his gaze back to Lara. "There's nothing you can do to change it now." Lara's hands shook at her sides as she stared at him. Her mind was reeling, spinning with questions. But the one that stood out above all the rest was simple. How do I escape this? Her eyes flicked to Farid, who seemed to be weighing his options. The newcomer was right. They were all caught in a game they didn't understand, and Lara was no longer sure if she had the strength to fight back. The newcomer smiled again, this time more sinister. "You should have stayed out of this, Lara," he said, his voice almost pitying. "And now you've learned the hard way. There's no way out." Lara's world tilted, and for a moment, she felt as if the walls were closing in on her. But in the chaos of her thoughts, one thing became clear. She wasn't done yet, not by a long shot. As the newcomer turned to leave, Farid's voice broke the silence. "Don't think this is over," he said, his voice cold and steady. "We're still going to take you down." The newcomer didn't look back as he walked out, leaving the room heavy with tension. Lara swallowed hard, her heart racing. Farid was right. This was far from over. But she was starting to understand something. She wasn't just fighting to survive. She was fighting to reclaim everything that had been stolen from her. And this time, she wasn't going down without a fight. The silence in the room hung like a thick fog, stifling and oppressive. Farid's words echoed in Lara's mind. "We're still going to take you down." The newcomer's cold smile lingered in her thoughts. And for the first time since all this chaos began, Lara felt a flicker of hope. She wasn't done. Her hands were still trembling, but a fierce determination burned deep in her chest. She couldn't afford to let fear control her. Not now. Not when the stakes were so high. Farid's sharp gaze fixed on the door, his mind racing. He knew this wasn't over. It couldn't be. Lara straightened, taking a slow, steady breath, her eyes narrowing with resolve. "You're right," she said, her voice steady, each word heavier than the last. "This isn't over." Farid glanced at her, surprised by the strength in her voice. "Lara," he started, but she cut him off. "I don't care who they are anymore, Farid. I don't care about their power, their games." She looked at him, her eyes burning with the fire she had kept hidden for so long. "I'm going to fight for my life." Farid's expression softened, a hint of pride breaking through his usual cold exterior. "You're sure?" he asked quietly. Lara nodded. "I'm sure. It's the only choice I have left." They both knew the truth of it. The game had changed. The man with the cold eyes. He had played his cards, but Lara wasn't ready to fold. She had lost so much already, and now, with every breath, she was clawing her way back. They couldn't take everything from her. Farid stepped closer, his gaze serious. "We're going to need help," he said. Lara didn't hesitate. "Get me the names. We go after them all." Farid's face hardened, determination now matching her own. "I'll start making calls." As he walked to the desk, Lara turned away, her mind running through everything she knew, piecing it together like a puzzle she was determined to solve. The enemy wasn't invincible, and Lara wasn't going to back down. There was still too much at stake, and as the first rays of light began to filter through the cracks in the room, Lara knew. She was going to take control back. The battle was just beginning. The quiet in the room was a contrast to the storm raging inside Lara's mind. She could hear the soft ticking of the clock, each second moving slower than the last, as if the world itself was holding its breath. She wasn't just fighting for survival anymore. She was fighting to reclaim the life that had been stolen from her, piece by piece. Farid's presence beside her was a constant reminder that she wasn't alone. Despite the chaos, despite the looming danger, she wasn't facing this battle by herself. And that made all the difference. Farid turned to her, his eyes sharp and focused, the weight of their shared mission evident in every glance. "We'll start with the people closest to them," he said, his voice steady. "We'll use their own strategy against them." Lara nodded, her fingers curling into fists, determination coursing through her. "We know their weaknesses now," she murmured, her voice low, but filled with resolve. "It's time they realized we're not the pawns in their game anymore." Farid gave a tight nod, impressed by her strength. Lara's thoughts raced, planning her next move, but in that moment, something shifted. She felt it in her bones. The weight of everything, the lies, the betrayal, the death, began to settle into the quiet space of the room. It wasn't over yet, not by a long shot, but the fight had changed. The clock continued to tick, the sound now almost reassuring. Every second that passed was a second closer to the end of this nightmare, and she would not stop until it was done. Farid took a step toward the door, looking back once more. "You ready?" Lara stood tall, her heart steady, eyes clear. "Ready." Together, they walked into the uncertainty ahead. The shadows of the past were closing in, but Lara had learned something important. The darkness wasn't as powerful as the light that burned inside her. With every step they took, Lara was reclaiming the pieces of her life, piece by piece. And this time, she wasn't just surviving, she was living. The battle had been fierce, and the journey had been long, but Lara was finally in control. The end of one chapter meant the beginning of another. And this time, it was hers to write.